Hi, and welcome to the Lensrentals Podcast, where we talk about images and the people who make them. I'm Roger Cicala, the founder of Lensrentals.com. Hello, and welcome to the Lensrentals Podcast. This is Roger Cicala. I have a special guest today I'm really excited about. Matthew Duclos is at least as big a geek as I am about lenses, and he comes at it from very different perspectives, so I'm looking forward to picking his brain, learning some things today. In case you don't know, and I think there's very few of you who don't, Matthew is the head lens geek, project manager, COO, whatever you want to call it, at Duclos Lenses, and excited to have you here today.
Thanks, Roger.
I think we'll start a little bit since our audience is probably mostly photographers with a sprinkling of video cinema people. I go over this a lot, and I think you may a little bit too, but cinematographers looking for something really different in a lens than a photographer most of the time. Do you agree?
Absolutely, and wholeheartedly.
Good. Can you kind of give us some background on what's a cinematographer looking at when he looks for a lens? Photographers keep asking me, why aren't they this, why aren't they that? And my response is always, that's not what they want. So what do they want?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. Generally, photographers have struggled to get the fastest, sharpest, cleanest lenses for the past couple decades. It's been a constant improvement in quality, whereas cinematographers shared a similar goal, but overall ended up going the other direction and wanting something less clean, less clinical over time. Especially with the current crop of motion picture lenses, it's really become the trend to have something that's, we'll say, a little more character rich and not perfect and clinical and sharp.
And I think also you look at a photographic print and everybody zooms in on the little details you get here and there. When it's a motion picture, that's a lot less important, isn't it?
Absolutely. With a photo, you observe it, you pixel peep, whether it's on a monitor or a print in a gallery, you're going to observe that moment captured in time for any length of time, maybe 5 seconds, maybe 5 minutes. You're going to look at that same moment in time. Whereas cinematography, it's ideally 24 moments per second, and it's constantly changing, and it's more of a fluid, organic image than it is just a moment.
Yeah, I've never heard anybody watching a movie go, I couldn't make out the grating on that air conditioner over there.
Yeah.
Now, you do something that I think and have thought for decades is really awesome, and that is you take certain photo lenses and convert them into cinema lenses. And I think before we get into any more detail, there's a lot of difference between what's going on with a cinema lens mechanically compared to a photo lens. When you do that conversion, what are you looking for? What are you choosing a lens that's worth converting?
So primarily, I'd say maybe when we started, it was my choice. I was choosing what lenses I wanted to convert. These days, it's more or less driven by what my customers want. There's definitely been some lenses that I don't think are well suited for motion picture work, but the customer insists it's what they want. They want something different or unique, and I'll reluctantly do it.
I can identify with that.
Yeah. But initially it was, I wanted something different, something unique, kind of like, I guess, what the customers currently look for, but not in the wild, crazy, this lens hasn't been pulled out of the box since 1920 kind of way, but more of a, I want this particular Leica lens has a nice look to it that is consistent across a set, and there's multiple focal lengths that all match in color and contrast and speed that lended themselves very nicely to motion picture work.
Okay. And aperture, does that play in very often, or is it kind of an afterthought?
For me, it does, but I know that there's a lot of cinematographers that couldn't care less what the aperture is. But when I first started doing these, it was definitely a consideration.
Okay. For people who don't know, and I think a lot of people that are listening to this have rarely, if ever, picked up a cinema lens any more than going, wow, they're big and heavy.
And expensive.
And expensive.
That's
and I
usually
guess that's the question I get constantly. Why do they cost so much? And I know, but I think you're better at telling people why do they cost so much, because it's really interesting to see the difference.
The primary reason they cost so much, I would say, is two primary reasons. One is because they can. Cinematographers and large multi-million-dollar productions are willing to pay more. But the real reason is just economy of scale. When you buy a Canon 18 to 55 kit lens and it costs $150 even on a bad day, that's because they're making tens of thousands of those things. So they can just hammer them out over and over and over. And the components are cheaper, the tolerances are looser, the entire production is just lower cost all around. Whereas most cinema lenses, you're talking about hundreds, maybe thousands of units, and the tolerances are much, much tighter, which means your rejection rate is much higher. Cinematographers' standards are more demanding. So every piece of that entire assembly process, the entire production line, is more costly, and that trickles down to the end price to the customer. That's not to say there's not money to be made. These manufacturers are skimming by, but it's definitely a much higher cost to make cinema lenses.
And some of the weight, the actual housing and barrels have to be a little more robust, don't they, to achieve those tolerances you're talking about?
Absolutely. In that case, it's all about the tolerances. The photo lenses generally are lighter and a lot more loose because they need to be driven by a relatively low-powered but fast motor for autofocus. So if you have a really heavy, and when I say heavy, I don't necessarily mean weight, but a viscous, smooth focus movement, you need a very large, very powerful motor to drive that fast. So generally, cinema lenses use external motors or hand-operated follow focuses, and those components have to be much bigger, much heavier for more accurate, precise movement.
One of the things that's always fascinated me, and I've had some of your conversions, and it's really cool to see the difference in focus throw, where the photo version, the focus ring may really turn 120 degrees or 90 degrees. The cinema version has a much longer throw.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have to remake the entire internal, basically do you take the glass and remake the entire internal housing to achieve that?
When we do an expansion of a focus assembly, yes. Well, there's two ways to go about it. I guess the easier way is to use sort of a gearing system, a relay that relies on gear ratios to expand that focus, which is cheaper and easier, but makes the lens much, much bigger. Mm-hmm. The better way to do it is to redesign the entire focus movement from scratch to give the customer exactly what they want.
That sounds like a big project with lots of engineers.
Yeah. Big project, very few engineers. We're still a very, very small company.
Very small company, but in what you do, I think you're certainly one of the more productive companies out there, if not one of the largest ones. And that brings me, what are some of the favorite mods you've done? You've done a ton of photo lenses to video lenses that I know of. Which ones did you like, whether on the front end or the back end?
So there's a couple different types of our modifications. There's what we call the Cine mod, which is for the most part superficial add-on components. And then there's the actual full, what most people would call a rehousing or a conversion.
The Cine mod is basically just putting geared rings on. Is that basically what you're doing?
Yeah, generally it's a standardized front ring, a focus gear, maybe an iris or zoom gear, declicking the aperture, maybe converting the mount. For the most part, superficial.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't require engineering for the most part. Of those, I don't know that I could pick a favorite. When we first started doing them, the original Cinemod was a guy. This was probably maybe 2004, 2005, and we had a customer that shot macro 3D. This is before the red camera was really popular, before all this sort of blew up.
Macro 3D.
So he needed to get lenses extremely close together, and very, very tight tolerances, very accurate focus. So he brought us some old, I think they were Nikon AIS lenses. I think he ended up upgrading to the Zeiss ZF line. This is before they even had the ZF2 line.
Mm-hmm.
And he just needed to be able to focus them at the same time. So he needed gears on them. And we added gears. We added the front rings so they could, he could put common filters on them. Declicked the iris so that he could run the iris manually. And he told a friend, and that friend told a friend, and the Cinemod just took off. We did it for this one project, thinking, it's sort of a means to an end, a quick solution. And we've converted or modified, I'd have to imagine, upwards of 10,000 lenses somewhere in there. I mean, it's been constant. So I don't know that I could possibly pick one lens that stood out for the Cinemod. But for the conversion, I would say it's probably our Leica 70 to 180 conversion. Mostly because that started as a personal project. The lens that Leica lens, the 70 to 180 Type R, it's not a particularly good lens. It has a ton of vignetting. The corners fall off. It's just not good on paper. And originally I had been using a Nikon body for still photography, and I always loved that lens, and I had converted it to Nikon mount a long time ago. And I always thought, if I ever get bored, I'll just do a conversion for this lens and make it a cinema lens because I loved it so much. And started to do it, put it on the back burner for years. And when we had a little more of a robust engineering team, we ended up going ahead with it. And I would say that's still one of my favorite conversions that we've done.
You've got one conversion set that I've seen recently, and it interests me so much because I liked the photo lenses, and that's the Voigtlander Noctons. What got that rolling for you?
That was, again, started as sort of a passion project. When the GH4 became so popular, I picked one up and I was playing with it a lot and just wasn't happy. I had been a Micro Four Thirds Olympus guy for a while, but I had never really tried the Panasonic stuff until the GH4 came out.
Mm-hmm.
So for my Olympus stuff, it was all, it was all the, the standard Olympus lenses, all the Zuiko stuff, because at the time the purpose was to have something small and lightweight, fast autofocus. And when I went to the GH4 and started doing more video stuff, they just didn't work as well. They weren't meeting my standards for motion picture work. And so I started looking around for fully manual Micro Four Thirds lenses, or at least something that I can convert to Micro Four Thirds. And at the time, it was just the 25 millimeter. There was no 17.5. There was no 45. All the additional, 42.5. So I converted that one 25 millimeter, put a gear and a front ring, declicked the iris, all that. And I loved it. I shot tons of content with that thing. Nothing professional. It's all hobbyist. It's all just personal projects. I have far too much respect for cinematographers to consider myself a cinematographer. So I just played with it a lot, and some people liked the stuff, and I did this was way before the blog was what it is now, but I did a comparison video and basically let people guess if it was shot on full frame or Micro Four Thirds. And because that 25 millimeter was such a fast aperture, 0.95, it was really hard for people to tell, and I would say most people got it wrong.
I get that.
Thinking that it was shot on full frame, even though it was a tiny little micro four thirds setup.
That's awesome. The Voigtlander Noctons, I can see where that just really took off. And although it's fading for us now, I don't know about you, the micro four thirds is not what it was, but for a while that was a ton of use for us. And the Noctons I could see really giving that kind of look where people had a little trouble differentiating what it was shot on, and I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people who listen to this are what I would call doing intro video. We have a lot of wedding shooters who are doing some video. We have a lot of people who are doing video on the side and hoping to get into it, et cetera. So they're still doing video with unmodified photo lenses. Have you got any recommendations in that range for folks that are listening?
I would say for most people that are shooting, let's say an A7 or I don't know if the 5D is still a thing, but the 5D,
it's still a thing, yeah.
Any of those what I'd call transitional cameras, they get so caught up on the camera specs and the latest greatest camera that they don't bother upgrading their lens. And I imagine most of them haven't even tried a cinema lens or just a manual operation lens for that matter. For those people that are on the cusp, I would say just try something cheap like a Rokinon Cine DS that has that full manual control.
And longer focus throw, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, with those, it's not even a longer focus throw compared to their photo lenses. It's really just a different sleeve than their traditional photo version. But having that manual control, having, and it doesn't have to be the Cine lens, just a manual control lens. Having that operational difference, I think, will open up a whole new world to them. Instead of using that tiny focus throw on your Canon kit lens or your Sony G Master lens.
What about things like the Zeiss Milvis or the Voigtlanders we talked about earlier? Do you see people having much success with those in full photo mount, or do you think going to the cinema style geared lens is more important?
You lost me there.
Well, we have a lot of people who do put a cinema lens and maybe even a follow focus, et cetera, mounted to their 5D4 or their A7S or whatever. And others who just use the photo lens and manually focus it like a Zeiss Milvis or a standard Voigtlander, one of the manual focus lenses in that situation. You have any real thoughts on if there's a benefit or I recommend Milvis a lot because I like the look, but I'm not sure it's the best tool for them as they transition.
It certainly can't hurt. I think it's those types of lenses, the Milvis, the Voigtlander Noctons, of the newer lenses. I think those are the best transitional tool going from stills to motion lenses.
Right.
And but that's not to say that you're not going to get an image. You're not going to get some kind of result by using your standard autofocus lens. But at a certain point, it makes a difference in how you're shooting a project. If you're doing, skateboard videos and you are actually relying on that autofocus of the Canon or Sony, whatever platform you're using, obviously that's a better tool than a manual focus Voigtlander or a Milvis.
Right.
So it's not to say that if you're shooting motion, you have to upgrade to a manual operation lens. It's certainly circumstantial.
That's a good point. I think I fell into the trap that I always tell my customers they're falling into of overgeneralizing. Yeah,
absolutely. And I see that across the board. People are saying, if you're shooting a multi-million-dollar feature film, you have to be using top-of-the-line cinema lenses from Cook or Arri or whatever. But you'd be amazed at some of the scenes that cut in. I don't want to name names, but there was a major blockbuster film that was just dropped photography, and some of the Some of the scenes used Voigtlanders, not the Noctons, but they used Voigtlander lenses mixed in with high-end cinema lenses.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody that's watching that film is going to be the wiser.
Yeah, I've seen similar things done where there's huge, massive cinema cameras with booms and everything else, and scattered throughout the scene are some other cinematographers using things like A7Ss and being discreet within the scene.
Mm-hmm.
And
And they're going to intercut that footage, and nobody's going to know.
We're talking about photo lenses, so I'm going to kind of skip over because this is something that I've read about and know nothing about, and I really want your input. But some of the manufacturers now are really pushing their electronically refocusing zooms, if you will, and I think it's the term like continuously focusing instead of being truly parfocal for a zoom lens. Have you got any feedback on that and whether it's a good idea or not? It seems to me not to be, but then I tend to be old and cynical and crotchety.
Well, then you and I have the same tendencies. I think it's the manufacturers trying to find a solution to a problem they solved a long time ago. Any lens or camera system that encourages autofocus of any kind at any point, it's just not going to work. It's not there yet.
Right.
Anytime the camera has to hunt for focus, it's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. I can't imagine watching a movie where the scene isn't supposed to have that look. You know, if you're supposed to be looking like the Blair Witch Project or something like that, where it's obviously supposed to look like it's hunting for focus and it's part of the scene, great, awesome.
Right.
But if you're watching, any project, any content, and that lens starts to look for focus for a split second, you just ruined that scene.
Yeah.
So until the camera and lens can be content aware and know exactly what you're trying to focus on, it's just not going to work. It'll never be organic. It'll never be correct. I don't know the correct term.
I think that I got your meaning. I think that was clear, and that was what I thought with no experience. And I tend to boldly put out opinions without knowing what I'm talking about. So I'm glad to hear you say that. Okay, another question I get constantly is this lens parfocal? Could you describe what is a real parfocal lens, or as near as possible what a real parfocal lens would be?
So ideally, a parfocal lens is a lens that holds its focus point throughout the zoom. So two opposite ends of the spectrum, I'd say you have something like a 24-290 Angenieux Optimo being a high-end cinema lens that is supposed to be parfocal, and you can be set to 24 millimeters at the wide end, rack focus, and then zoom all the way into 290 millimeters, and it will hold focus through that entire range without budging, wherever you put your focus.
Still right in focus from one end to the other.
You won't have to refocus at all. Whereas the opposite end of that, you have something like I don't mean to throw anyone under the bus, so I'll just say a 24-70, because pretty much every still photo manufacturer makes one of those.
Right.
Yeah. And you could do the same thing. You'd focus at 24, then you zoom into 70, and all of a sudden you need to rack focus again because somewhere along that focal length, it lost its focus.
And with most photo lenses, going from 24 to 30 would put you out of focus, really.
Exactly. Anytime you change the zoom. And for photo lenses, it really doesn't matter because you're going to have to press that shutter. The lens is going to autofocus, and your photo will be perfect. But for cinema lenses, it's extremely important. If you're zooming during your shot or even zooming between shots, you don't want to have to take that extra time to refocus. And you can't refocus if it's during a shot. Granted, zooming during a shot isn't as popular as it used to be. That was definitely more popular or more stylish in the 70s and 80s. But it's still not uncommon. So a lens being parfocal is it's fairly important for motion picture work.
Now, I get asked, certain photo lenses are sort of parfocal. They're all barizooms, that is, they're not really maintaining focus completely. but they seem to be close enough. Over the years, my definition of that has changed as sensors have gotten better, and we've gone from mostly shooting on, say, micro four thirds to mostly shooting on full frame. There's also some copy-to-copy variation. For instance, I've had people who say, well, this lens was parfocal on my camera when I used it last time, and you sent me another one, it's no longer parfocal. That's part of the photo game. That's just what it is. Field curvature on zooms actually changes depending on the copy, et cetera. What do they do in a true cinezoom to try to compensate for that?
So in a cinema lens, it's essentially a built-in magnification or a built-in compensator. So your lens is essentially zooming in or out to correct for that difference in back focus.
So as you're zooming, it's actually moving your focus group also.
Exactly. And just tolerances all around. I mean, that's step one, is having tight enough tolerances that you don't have that slop or that play.
And when someone has been, let's say shooting on a GH5, and then their budget goes up and they get a full frame red and put that same photo lens on it, what was parfocal enough is no longer really parfocal, is it?
Correct, yeah. And it's a matter of really how closely you're looking. Even, like I said, that 24-290 Optimo, if you look close enough, it's not going to be parfocal either. So no matter how much someone claims a lens is parfocal, there really isn't any true parfocal lens if you're looking close enough.
So this whole discussion really should be, is it parfocal enough for my purposes?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think we talked a little bit about the manufacturers, and especially now that they've got electromagnetic focus motors that are supposedly silent, whether they are or not, are kind of pushing their photo lenses for continuous focus video. I could see some purpose in that. And now they're pushing their zoom lenses for, if you zoom our lens, it will compensate and be parfocal. You have any thoughts on all of that?
The zooming to be parfocal, or I should say the correction built into the lens, I think it could work.
Okay.
But again, when you're looking close enough, the accuracy of a lens in regards to how it focuses throughout the zoom is still completely dependent on the camera as well. That distance, that flange depth, the back focus, you can tune it to the tightest tolerances possible in the lens. But if that camera isn't also tuned perfectly, the lens is still going to struggle. So unless there's a way for the camera and the lens to both be talking to each other, saying, yes, this is good, without that hunting that I was talking about before, without that, I don't think it could work. If the lens was somehow compensating and correcting it for itself, that's great. But if the camera is out of spec, it's not going to help.
Yeah, that's something we haven't talked about, but I see constantly. The difference between the mount on a cinema camera, a true cinema camera, and a photo camera being used for cinema. We constantly, of course, you can't adjust the photo camera. You usually can the cinema camera, but we constantly see photo cameras. The mount is not a really robust structure.
No, not at all.
And then also you see, the last guy who used it carried around a 70 to 200 2.8 by the camera. But those mounts, they're often a little tilted. The back focus distance isn't quite exact, and that does have some effect on everything.
Absolutely. And again, that goes back to, for the photo cameras, when you have to press that shutter and the lens autofocuses, it doesn't matter if that flange is off on the camera by a half of a thousandth of an inch or even 2/1000ths, whatever. The lens is still going to autofocus.
Right.
And you're still going to get a sharp picture when you fully depress that button. But for cinema, it just throws everything out. That's just not how it works.
I think the other part, too, that's probably more critical for cinema, if that mount is tilted a few thousandth up one side and down the other, it can really make things look odd.
Yeah, if your flange tip is out, you can usually compensate a little bit. Your focus marks just aren't perfect, or you have to focus through infinity. you can get by. But if your mount is tilted, there's nothing you can do.
Yeah. Bad things happen. Okay, we talked about all the cool lenses and the fun lenses and things about lenses, and I think did a pretty good job of introducing people to the difference of cinema and photo lenses. One thing you and I have in common, we see lots of broken lenses.
Yeah.
And,
absolutely.
Yeah, everything breaks if rented long enough, in my experience, and I think if used long enough in yours. You guys have quite a cinema repair facility. We use it quite a bit, and why don't you kind of talk about maybe perhaps things that you commonly see, because I think they're, particularly in cinema lenses are often not obviously broken, but they are broken, if that makes sense. They're not performing up to snuff, yet they're not obviously not focusing anymore or things like that. What kind of things do you commonly see that you guys tend to work on in that not obviously broken in half category?
Yeah. In the not obvious category, I would say some of the most common stuff would be just simple back focus adjustments that keeps us pretty busy. Some common things that people may not even think or may not even see would be stuff like loose end stops, where the zoom or the focus is traveling past its intended movement, which could lead to glass impacting other glass elements.
That's a bad idea.
Yeah, it's not uncommon. I mean, some lens manufacturers compensate for it, or at least protect for it, and put an O-ring in there so that if it does go past, it's just bumping the O-ring and not the glass. Lots of little things, alignment issues, axial alignment that most of our customers don't necessarily have the equipment to recognize. Stuff that doesn't necessarily show up on camera unless you're in very specific conditions.
Right.
But on our test equipment shows up clear as day.
And I think that's another good point, because people are shooting on different things, and the lens that was just fine on Joe's, GH5 is probably not going to be fine on Bill's Red Monstro.
That's at the moment that's a huge topic that spans not just our customers, but even I do a lot of work with the ASC, and it's a huge debate right now with or it's becoming one, the inter-camera compatibility of lenses. Even within the same mount, you take a lens that's tuned perfectly. The flange depth for PL mount, the calibration is supposed to be 52 millimeters, period.
Right.
So PL mount lenses should work on PL mount cameras across the board. But what we're starting to see is that we have to tune lenses to different cameras, because the OLPF, or the low pass filter, in certain camera models is different than others.
Yeah,
and
the
that
thickness,
extra
are you
piece of
talking about
glass,
there? The thickness of the low pass filter?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
It varies, and that can, if you're looking closely enough, that can change your focus accuracy going from one camera to another. Even though everything's tuned to its specification, the camera's tuned, the lens is tuned. Going from one camera to another could easily throw off your focus marks.
Yeah, for our photo listeners, we fought that battle some years ago when people were adapting lenses from one camera to another, and the different cameras had very different low pass filter glass thickness. And it was always a shock to people. Well, I bought this expensive Leica lens, and it looks like crap on my Canon camera with an adapter. And we're all like, of course it does.
Yeah, it's got to be, that has to be taken into consideration.
Do you recommend to most of your regular customers a kind of a disassembly inspection or disassembly clean and lube kind of thing every so often to check for this kind of stuff?
Yes and no. We get that question all the time. When we sell a new lens, the customer usually will say, well, hey, how long till I should bring this in for service? Which is part of buying a lens from us, is every lens comes with 2 years. I don't mean to sound like a commercial, but
no, it's important for people to get this, because this is really different in different ways when you buy a lens.
Yeah, and that's why we do that 2 years of maintenance. It's inevitably when we tell them, yeah, you get 2 years of maintenance for free, they say, oh, when should I bring it in? And I tell them it completely depends on what you're shooting and how you're shooting. just like a lot of the other questions, I hate to keep using it as a stock answer, but a good example, we have a customer that he makes a living shooting motocross. And so his lenses are constantly covered in sand and dirt and grime, and he brings his stuff in, I don't know, maybe every 2 months just for he doesn't even bother to say this and this is wrong. He says, hey, just give it the works, give it whatever it needs, because that's his living. Whereas we have other customers that shoot, they specialize in shooting corporate videos, so they're always in a nice, clean, air-conditioned office, and everything's set up nice and simple, and it's low impact. They hardly never, I don't think they would ever need to bring stuff in. Maybe once every 5 years just for a simple checkup, but it completely depends what you're shooting and how you're shooting.
I like that message. You and I get the same message, I think, over and over again. It depends, because everybody wants a stock answer, and everybody's circumstances are different. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be back with Matthew Duclos in just a minute.
Hi, I am S.J. Smith, and this is a spotlight on Mary Hobbs. Hello.
Hi, SJ.
How are you?
I'm good.
What is your title?
My title here is Repair Coordinator.
And what does that mean?
That means I work with third-party repair service centers to get our broken equipment back in working order for our renters.
What kind of creative work do you do outside of here?
Outside of Lensrentals, I make YouTube videos. I actually have 2 different channels. Both have around 7,000 subscribers. I have Mid-South Bride, where I do DIY and wedding content, and then I have a channel called A Merry Life on a Budget, where I talk about money when you're not a money nerd or even really that good at math.
How did you get started in that?
I actually took a trip to Alaska 2 years ago, and because I'm not a photographer, I wanted to rent some gear from work, and so I took a GoPro and I made some travel videos.
How did that transition into money?
It was actually an accident. I shared how much my Alaska trip cost and how I was able to use like credit card points to pay for some of it, and then I fell into related content creators who were talking about their budgets and how they were able to afford the lives that they really wanted by managing their money better. And I'd always had an interest in budgeting and managing money, so I started doing my own videos, and it just kind of snowballed from there.
That's really neat. Is it scary to talk about money so openly?
Yes, I'm actually usually a little bit worried that someone's going to find my videos that I don't necessarily want them to know that much about my personal life, but I have set boundaries around what I do share and what I don't share that I've discussed with my husband, and we have those in place. And honestly, the people on YouTube have been super supportive. I have a really supportive community, so I get a ton of comments and feedback that's really positive.
Do you have any go-to advice that you tend to give people when they find out that you talk about money and budgeting? I guess particularly for women, since that's probably the majority of your audience.
Yes, I generally, for women, they get a lot of messaging that you can't win with money without having a spouse that is earning more or doing the money for you. And a lot of women, including myself, don't tend to think of ourselves as very numbers oriented or good at math. But ultimately, I think that I tell people, when you're paying attention, even if you're not doing it perfectly, you're going to succeed. So you don't have to have a certain plan or a certain way of doing it. As long as you're paying attention and continually improving what you're doing, you're going to get better and better.
And where can we find you on the internet?
You can find my channel by searching A Merry Life on a Budget, or my website, amerilife.com.
And we will link to that in the show notes. Thanks so much for talking.
Thanks. This is fun.
We talked about the minor repairs. What kind of big repairs do you see with cinema lenses particularly?
When you say big, you mean the big invoice or the big time?
The big invoice, because I think sometimes people are shocked. You know, their lens is broken in half. They expect that's going to be expensive. Their lens isn't focusing right, and they think it's going to be $500, and it's $2,000 and they don't understand why. So, kind of, what are the bigger invoice repairs that you see? Or that
I would say some of the bigger dollar values would be some of the high-end cine zooms. And it's really just a matter of time. It's not so much the cost of the parts, and that can obviously add to the bill, but a technician's time is the absolutely most valuable thing when it comes to repairing a lens. With photo lenses, it's usually just a matter of if something's not right or something's broken, you pull a whole section out, replace it with a new one from the manufacturer. But with cinema lenses, it's more about repair and the skill and talent of that technician. Because the value of these lenses is so much higher, it just doesn't make sense to throw something away and replace it. It's more economical, it's quicker, everything is just easier to repair than it is to replace.
But just disassembling a big Cinezoom, that's a lengthy task.
I'll use that 24 to 290 for example. Just again, not because it's prone to defects or anything like that. It's just that it's such a staple in our industry. We see them all the time for all sorts of problems. So I would say that's one of the higher cost lenses to service just because it's so complex. It's about a 23-pound zoom lens with a 12 times zoom range. So it's a pretty complex piece of equipment. Not only is it complex, it's also very delicate. Putting a 10-inch piece of glass on a couple rollers means it's gonna need alignment sooner or later. So some of the more expensive stuff doesn't necessarily mean that it was a devastating incident, but it could just be, hey, this lens has been in the field for 12 months straight getting nonstop use. It needs an overhaul. So that obviously entails taking the whole thing apart, cleaning out all the grease, cleaning every piece of glass, putting everything back together, aligning everything, tuning everything, all new grease. I think generally we invoice it for about 12 hours of labor, which if your average workday is 8 hours, that's about 2 days of a technician sitting on a bench with a lens.
That's actually less than I thought you were going to say. I was thinking 3 days.
Well, that's assuming everything goes well.
Okay,
also.
yeah, good
There's
point.
always surprises. There's always stuff that you can't see. And it sounds cliche, but it's like when you take your car to a mechanic and you just say, they say, oh, you need this. And then they call you back 5 hours later and say, we took this apart. Now you need this, this, and this. And it sounds like a scam, but you can't, there's no x-ray vision for lenses. You can't see in there to see what's going on. You have to take it apart to find out.
Yeah, you can't.
So there's always
see
little
something.
catches. There's always.
I'm sorry, but you can't see something that it takes you 2 hours to disassemble. You can't look in the end of the lens and see that.
Exactly. Some stuff you can, obviously, because it's glass. That helps. But yeah, there's just so much there's so much symphony. There's so many moving pieces in that lens that it's hard to know exactly what is going to be needed at the end of the day. So there's always surprises. The standard rate for an overhaul on that lens is about 12 hours.
Yeah. And while we're talking about techs and time, I think something else people don't realize is you have a lot of really skilled lens repair techs. That's not an easy person to find.
No, it's not.
and I think it's harder these days than it used to be, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, there's no lens school repair graduates every June that you can go hire.
No, I would say it's harder to find. It's easier to find eager, enthusiastic individuals. It's harder to find talented, skilled technicians, experienced technicians. I think the current generation, which I'm kind of separating myself from, is very much the instant gratification. They want everything immediately, and if they want to be a lens tech, they just have to start doing it, and they consider themselves a lens tech. But It takes many, many years. I've been doing lens work unofficially for about 20 years. officially, like on paper, maybe 15 years. My father, who still works, he's in the office right next to me. He's every day a technician. He's been doing it for 30 some odd years. We have a couple other technicians that have been doing it for an additional 30 to 40 years. And for the technicians that we didn't bring on as a full technician, they always start in our apprentice position. Mm-hmm. So we rely on our knowledgeable, skilled, experienced technicians to teach that younger generation. So we don't really ever hire anyone that doesn't have at least a couple years of dedicated lens experience as a lens technician. They start in that junior apprentice position and they get trained.
Yeah, I think even with simple photo lenses, I tell people who come on, in a year or so, you can do some basic repairs.
Yeah, yeah.
Cinema lenses.
Until then, you clean elements and dust off bodies.
Yeah, exactly. But it's people don't realize what a long process it is to learn that, and how few people have that skill. I'm thinking of this because I got an email the other day that when I said how much something would be to repair and how many hours it took, they went, "I don't see why you'd charge more than $35 an hour." And I laughed and laughed. But yeah, on that topic, your skilled lens technicians, what's their average age? Around 50?
I bring that average down quite a bit.
Okay, you do, but other than you.
but the other ones, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there's not a ton of young people out there that you can go hire.
Right, and it's also worth noting, you can get training from a manufacturer. Most of the manufacturers offer training to rental houses or dealers of their products. Mm-hmm. But just that training, just because you have a certificate doesn't mean you're skilled. It means that manufacturer brought you to their facility and you listened to them talk for a couple hours.
Right. That
experience, knowing the little tricks and knowing the quirks and the history, that's invaluable.
Not just that, but even some of the basic things. Taking these little screws out without stripping them, that's a skill. It takes some time to develop.
Absolutely. We have at least once a week, if not more. We get very specific lenses, the Zeiss Contax lenses that we perform the Cinemod on. They're very popular, but they are notorious for having overly Loctited screws. And at least once a week, we get a customer that sends one in saying, "Hey, I was going to do this mount conversion myself, but I stripped the screws." And all it does is make it more difficult and more expensive.
Yeah, much more. What are you seeing these days as far as trends in cinema lenses? I know that full-frame cinema has become, the last several years, more and more of a big thing and a common thing.
Yeah, I think it's become very popular because it's new. I don't know if it's gonna stick or if it's just a trend. Mm-hmm. Super 35 was the standard for 100 years in cinema.
Right.
Everybody, you shot the low budget stuff on 16 millimeter film, which I kind of equate to today's version would be micro four thirds. So if you're shooting low budget or documentary stuff, you shoot micro four thirds. And then the really high end, really visually stunning stuff was shot on VistaVision, which is now today's equivalent of full frame, like the Red Monstro or something like that. Mm-hmm. Alexa LF, Sony Venice, all those. But shooting VistaVision back in the film days was vastly more expensive. And now with digital cinematography, it really doesn't change the cost of shooting. But it's sort of become the new fad, and everybody's scrambling to get full frame lenses and full frame cameras, and the resolution of the full frame cameras is going up even higher. And I think it's a trend at the moment. I don't think it's going to fade away, but I don't think that Super 35 is going away either. So full frame lenses, they're not really that new. Full frame cinema lenses have been around for quite a while. I think the some of the older rehoused lenses were full frame before people even knew, before they cared. They were only shooting Super 35 at the time, but the lenses were capable of covering much larger formats. The first ones that come to mind would be some of the old Century Optics rehoused lenses, especially the telephotos. Obviously, those covered more than full frame. But then some of the lesser known stuff, like there was a company that's not in business anymore called Dalsa Digital that made some pretty early digital cinema cameras, and in that process made a cinema lens that was based on the Leica R lenses. They just rehoused the Leica R series.
Right.
And so those lenses, even though that sensor was never anything bigger than Super 35, those lenses covered full frame. And they are now becoming popular again, or they're very rare because the company went out of business, but they had been, full frame lenses had been around for decades. Even going back to like the CP, well, before they were CP2s, they were just compact primes. Those were full frame before there was even a full frame cinema camera. At the time, it was the 5D was the full frame cinema camera.
Right, and the Zeiss lenses were pretty much conversions from photo to the CP format.
Exactly, yeah. So the full frame lens craze is definitely, it's happening right now, and everybody's trying to find the best solution for lensing the full frame camera. But it's certainly nothing new.
It seems that there's a huge investment in electrons when you shoot full frame as opposed to Super 35. And I know the equipment can handle it, but is the expense of processing and shooting in that kind of film, or that kind of format rather, an issue, or is it really not much more expensive than if you shot the Super 35 once you get the lenses and camera?
I don't know that I'm the best person to answer that, and the only reason I say that is because I can't think of any added expense.
Okay.
Some people may argue, well, you're shooting full frame or VistaVision, so it's a higher resolution, which means you need more, a higher powered computer and more data storage. But 8K full frame, it should be the same data as 8K Super 35.
Okay. So the investment's more in equipment than in anything.
I think so, yeah. I don't see, I had a woman at a lecture I was giving recently say that shooting anamorphic is more expensive because you need more light. And I didn't understand that. I didn't know why she was saying that, because the amount of light you need is not determined by your squeeze ratio or your format. It's determined by the speed of your lens and the sensitivity of your film or your sensor. So I think the same argument some people are making for full frame is, you need this or you need that. It's different, but I don't see how that is. So I might be wrong. Someone else may give an explanation that makes more sense. But as far as I could tell, it's just a different artistic choice at this point.
I could see that. And, of course, everybody has to do it because it's new. I think you hit that nail on the head.
Yeah.
In the photo world, we have the equivalent where everybody shoots the highest resolution camera to post their photos on Facebook. But
at 1080 by 1080.
Yeah. All right. Well, I thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure for me, and I've learned a lot. If you don't, I really recommend you follow Matthew's blog at thecinelens.com and the website at ducloslenses.com, and we'll have links to those at the end of this podcast. Anything you want to add before we go, Matthew?
Just the usual Instagram, Facebook, follow /Duclos Lenses, and don't ever hesitate to reach out with questions.
Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time out to do this today. I've been looking forward to it for 2 weeks, and it's met my expectations, so I'm really pleased.
Good. I'm glad.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Lensrentals Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, let us know at podcast@lensrentals.com. I'll leave with this quote by Walt Disney. We don't make movies to make money. We make money to make movies.